Every building that stands is an act of trust. Trust in the architect who designed it. Trust in the engineers who calculated its load capacity. Trust in the contractors who built it. Trust in the inspectors who signed off on it. Trust in the materials that were specified and the materials that were actually used, which are not always the same thing. When a building fails, when it collapses, partially or fully, and people are hurt or killed, that trust is broken. And the question of whose trust was misplaced, and at which point in the long chain from design to completion, is one of the most technically complex questions the legal system is ever asked to answer. The legal system is not always equipped to answer it correctly. Michael Ajay was 47 years old in July 2013, when a partially completed residential building on the outskirts of Lagos, Nigeria, a building his firm had designed, collapsed during construction. 3 workers were killed. 7 were injured. Michael's firm had designed the building. His signature was on the architectural plans. But the building that collapsed was not the building he had designed. The contractors had made material substitutions during construction, using cheaper materials than those specified, without informing Michael's firm or seeking approval. The structural calculations in the original plans were sound. The substituted materials were not. Michael was arrested, tried in a Nigerian federal court, and convicted of criminal negligence causing death. He was sentenced to 7 years. He served 4 before the evidence of the contractor's substitutions was fully established and his conviction was overturned. This is the story of what happens when a building falls and the person who designed it is blamed for what the people who built it did, and of the specific difficulty of establishing the truth in a technical domain that most legal systems are not adequately equipped to interrogate. Michael Ajay had grown up in Accra, Ghana, the son of a civil servant and a schoolteacher. He had studied architecture at the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, then completed a postgraduate qualification at the University of Lagos, where he had remained, drawn by Nigeria's scale, its ambition, its pace of construction and development that created, in the 2000s, more architectural work than almost anywhere in the continent. He had founded his own firm, Ajay Associates, in 2004. By 2013, the firm employed 11 architects and had completed 34 projects across Lagos and Abuja, residential developments, commercial buildings, a school complex, a small hospital extension. His reputation was built on designs that were practical, well-calculated, and delivered within the structural and material specifications he set. The Ikeja Heights project, the residential development whose partial collapse would destroy 4 years of his life, had been commissioned in 2011. It was a 7-story residential block of 24 apartments, intended for middle-income families. Michael's firm had designed the structure to meet and exceed the relevant Nigerian building codes. The materials specified were of adequate grade for the load calculations. The structural engineering had been reviewed and approved by a certified structural engineer. The construction contract had been awarded to a firm called Buildco Limited. Buildco was not Michael's recommendation. The client had their own preferred contractor, which is common and not inherently problematic. Michael's responsibility, as the architect of record, was to conduct site visits during construction to monitor compliance with the plans. He had conducted those site visits. He had logged them. He had raised concerns, in writing, in November 2012 and again in February 2013, about the speed of construction and the handling of certain structural elements. He had received written assurances from the contractor that the concerns were being addressed. They had not been addressed. The contractor had substituted cheaper reinforcing steel than specified. They had also reduced the concrete mix strength below specification. The 2 substitutions together produced a structure that was not capable of bearing the loads the original design had specified. Michael did not know this. He had been told the specifications were being met. What Buildco Limited had done during the construction of Ikeja Heights was technically sophisticated and deliberately concealed. The reinforcing steel specified in Michael's plans was grade 460, a standard high-yield deformed bar used in structural reinforced concrete. Buildco had substituted grade 250, plain round bar, cheaper, with significantly lower tensile strength. The substitution had been made systematically across the structural elements of the building, not in one place but throughout. The concrete mix specified was grade C30, a standard structural concrete with a characteristic compressive strength of 30 newtons per square millimeter. Buildco had supplied concrete from a supplier whose product consistently fell below this specification, a fact documented in that supplier's own quality records, which had not been provided to the project or to Michael's firm. The combination of weaker steel and weaker concrete produced a structure that was, under the specific loading conditions of a building under active construction, susceptible to progressive collapse if a critical element was stressed beyond its reduced capacity. On the morning of July 12, 2013, a concrete pour on the 5th floor created a loading condition that exceeded the capacity of the substituted structure. A section of the 5th floor collapsed. The collapse propagated to the 4th floor. 3 workers on those floors were killed. 7 more were injured. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Lagos State Building Control Authority and the Council for the Regulation of Engineering in Nigeria. In the immediate aftermath of a collapse that had killed 3 people, the investigation moved quickly. It focused on the person whose name was on the plans. Michael Ajay's signature was on the architectural drawings. His firm was the architect of record. In the urgent, public-facing context of a fatal collapse, the architecture of responsibility followed the architecture of the building, and the person who had designed it was the person who was held responsible for it. The material substitutions were noted in the initial investigation report, but the report's conclusion attributed the collapse primarily to design deficiency, to the structural calculations having been inadequate for the building's load requirements. This conclusion was reached quickly, without the full forensic material analysis that a thorough investigation would have required. It was wrong, but it was the conclusion that the prosecution built its case on. Michael Ajay was tried before a federal high court in Lagos in March 2014. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution's case rested on the initial investigation report, which attributed the collapse to design deficiency. They presented the building's structural failure as evidence that the design had been inadequate. They argued that Michael, as the architect of record, bore criminal responsibility for the deaths of the 3 workers. The defense challenged the investigation report's methodology. They engaged an independent structural engineer, a British-trained Nigerian engineer named Dr. Emeka Obi, who testified that the collapse was entirely consistent with material substitution and entirely inconsistent with the design as drawn. Dr. Obi testified that the original plans were structurally adequate and that if the specified materials had been used, the building would not have failed under the conditions that produced the collapse. The prosecution countered with the government investigation report and with the presumption, articulated by the lead investigator on the stand, that as the architect of record, Michael bore ultimate responsibility for what was built under his plans. This presumption, that the architect is responsible for what the contractor builds, has a specific legal basis in some contexts and is incorrect in others. In Nigerian law, as in most common law jurisdictions, the architect is responsible for the design and for reasonable supervision, but the contractor is responsible for the materials used and the construction methods employed. If a contractor substitutes materials without the architect's knowledge or approval, the responsibility for the consequences of that substitution lies with the contractor, not the architect. This legal distinction was made by Michael's defense. It was not clearly absorbed by the court. Michael was convicted of criminal negligence causing death on 3 counts. He was sentenced to 7 years in the Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison in Lagos. He was 48 years old. He had 11 employees whose futures were now uncertain. He had 2 children, 19 and 16, whose father was now a convicted criminal. He had a reputation that had been built over 20 years and would take considerably longer to recover. Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison in Apapa, Lagos is one of the oldest and most overcrowded prisons in Nigeria. It was built in the colonial era for a fraction of its current population and has been the subject of recurring human rights reports documenting conditions that fall significantly below international standards. Michael Ajay entered Kirikiri in April 2014. He was a professional in his late 40s who had never been in trouble with the law. He was placed in a general facility with a mixed population. He adapted by doing what he knew how to do. Within months of his arrival, he had offered his skills to the prison administration, specifically his ability to read and produce technical drawings. The prison had a maintenance backlog and a shortage of people who could document what needed to be done and how to do it. Michael produced drawings, specifications, and maintenance plans. He was given limited tools and materials, and he worked with them. He also continued to build his own case. His wife, Akojua, who had remained in Accra with their children and managed the suspension of Ajay associates, worked with their legal team on the outside. The firm had not been dissolved, it had been suspended, its projects referred to partner firms, its staff retained on reduced arrangements as long as possible. The key to Michael's case was the material substitution. It needed to be established conclusively, not through inference from the collapse, but through direct forensic analysis of the materials actually used. This required samples from the collapsed structure, which had been partially cleared by the time the investigation's inadequacy became clear, and construction records from Buildco Limited, which had been placed in administration 6 months after the collapse. Buildco's administrator, in the process of winding up the company's affairs, had found in the company's files a set of procurement records that had not been provided to the original investigation. The records showed the steel and concrete orders placed for the Acacia Heights project. They showed the grades ordered. They showed that what was ordered did not match what was specified. The administrator, to his credit, recognized what the records showed and informed the Council for the Regulation of Engineering in Nigeria. The Council for the Regulation of Engineering in Nigeria commissioned an independent forensic engineering review of the Acacia Heights collapse in 2016, following the administrator's disclosure of the procurement records. The review was conducted by a panel of 3 engineers, 2 Nigerian and 1 international, a British structural engineer named Dr. Patricia Walsh, who had 20 years of experience in collapse investigation. The panel had access to the procurement records, to samples taken from the collapsed structure before clearance, and to Michael's original design plans. Their report, completed in November 2016, was unequivocal. The original design, the panel found, was structurally adequate for the building's intended purpose. The structural calculations were correct. The specified materials, grade 460 steel and C30 concrete, would have produced a structure capable of bearing the design loads. The materials actually used were not the specified materials. The grade 250 steel had a tensile strength approximately 45% lower than specified. The concrete supplied had a compressive strength approximately 30% below specification. The combination of these 2 substitutions, applied systematically across the structural elements, produced a building that was structurally deficient from the moment construction was completed. The collapse was caused by the material substitutions. Not by the design, not by the supervision, by the contractor's decision to use cheaper materials and conceal that decision from the architect and the client. Michael Ajay's written concerns of November 2012 and February 2013 were noted in the panel's report as evidence of reasonable professional diligence. The panel found no evidence of negligence on his part. They found extensive evidence of negligence and deliberate concealment on the part of Buildco Limited. The directors of Buildco Limited were, by this point, the subject of separate criminal proceedings for fraud related to the company's collapse. The material substitution evidence was added to those proceedings. Michael Ajay's appeal was heard by the Court of Appeal of Nigeria in March 2017. The engineering panel's report was the centerpiece of the new evidence. The prosecution, reviewing the panel's findings, did not oppose the appeal. The conviction was quashed in March 2017. Michael had served 3 years and 11 months of his 7-year sentence. He walked out of Kirikiri on a hot March morning. Akojua had flown from Accra with their children, now 23 and 20, the previous day. They had been waiting outside since early morning. Michael's oldest child, his son Kwame, was 23 and had completed his first year of architectural school. He had enrolled in architecture, his father's discipline, during his father's imprisonment. He had told his father, on a prison visit in 2015, that he was going to become an architect because someone had to continue the work properly. Michael had said, "You don't have to do that for me." Kwame had said, "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because buildings matter and the people who design them matter. You showed me that. Even from in there, you showed me that." When Michael came through the prison gates, Kwame was standing there in a Kumasi University of Architecture and Technology sweatshirt. Michael saw the sweatshirt. He stopped walking for a moment. Then he kept walking, toward his family, in the March heat of Lagos. And the work continued. The directors of Buildco Limited were convicted of fraud and criminal negligence in 2018, in separate proceedings that incorporated the material substitution evidence. They received sentences of between 4 and 6 years. Michael Ajay received compensation through a civil claim against Buildco's insurers, the company itself having been wound up, and through a settlement with the Nigerian government in acknowledgement of the failure of the original investigation. The families of the 3 workers who died received civil compensation as part of the BuildCo proceedings. Their deaths remain the most important fact of the entire affair. Lives lost not because a building was badly designed, but because the people who built it decided that profit was worth more than the lives of the people working on it. The Council for the Regulation of Engineering in Nigeria, following the case, reviewed its procedures for investigating building collapses. It introduced a mandatory material testing protocol for any collapse investigation involving fatalities, a protocol that requires independent forensic material analysis before any conclusion about design deficiency can be drawn. Michael Ajay returned to practice. Ajay Associates reopened in Lagos in 2018. He rebuilt the team. Some of the original 11 returned, others had moved on. He approached the work with the additional rigor of someone who understood, with perfect personal clarity, what happens when the chain of trust that holds a building together is broken. Every project his firm takes on now includes, as a contractual requirement, independent material testing at each structural stage of construction. The testing is conducted by a third party specified by Ajay Associates, not by the contractor. The results are provided directly to Michael's firm. He says this is not an unusual requirement. He says it should not have been unusual before his imprisonment. He says the building industry in Nigeria, and in many places beyond it, relies on trust between parties who do not always share the same interests, and that trust without verification is a foundation that can fail. He pauses. He is an architect. He knows what foundations mean. He says, every building I design, I am thinking about those 3 workers, about what they believed when they came to work that morning, that the building they were working on had been properly constructed. That belief was not wrong. They had the right to that belief. The people who took it from them were not me. But I was the one who paid for it. He says, I am still paying for it. That is how it is. You carry what you carry. What I can do is make sure that every building that carries my name is built to what my plans say. Every single one. No substitutions. No exceptions. He says, that is the only monument I can build to those 3 men. Then he goes back to his drawing board. He always goes back to his drawing board.